Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LATAM Stocks Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Flood. Today I'm speaking with Frederico Nobre. He's the head of research at Warren's Brazilian brokerage and asset manager. His specialty as an analyst is with the commodity sector, and he's especially focused on oil and gas in Brazil. So we're going to talk about a lot about his views on Brazilian oil and gas companies. So let's get right into it. Hi, Frederico. How are you? I appreciate you being here.
Hi, Patrick. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with your audience, speak a little bit more about Brazilian stocks, about oil and gas. We have much to talk about, right?
Yeah. I'm really excited to talk about Brazilian oil and gas. It's been a topic that's on the front of a lot of investors' minds, oil prices. But before we do that, I want to know a little bit more about you. So can you tell me a little more about your background, where you're from, what led you to focus on the commodity sector, how you became the head of research at Warren?
Perfect. Well, Patrick, so let introduce myself to your audience very quick. Of course, we're not speaking about Fred, so I'm going to be very short on my description. But in Brazil, I studied economics in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I always wanted to work with financial markets. So I started working very young, with 18 to 19 years old, in a brokerage house. So it's a common path in Brazil. You start at back office and then you go climbing. It's very, very fast in Brazil. And so I had my first internship in a brokerage house, and after that I went to the brokerage sales trading desk, and then I saw another opportunity to work in Refinitiv. I'm pretty sure everyone knows Refinitiv. It's part of London Stock Exchange Group, formerly Reuters, financial and risk business. So Reuters is the major news content in the world. So they cover almost all topics in financial markets all over the world. And then I used to work in Reuters from 2016 to 2018. And then I work in S&P Global, not on the ratings part, but on the commodity side, which was Platts at the time. Then the company, there was a merge, S&P Global with IHS Markit, and then Platts became S&P Global Commodities Insights. So in Reuters as well as in S&P Global, I used to cover commodities companies in LATAM. So in Reuters, my main focus, biggest client was Petrobras. Of course, we're going to speak a little bit more about Petrobras today. And as well as in S&P. So I spent from 2016 to 2021. I used to go to Petrobras like twice or three times a week physically. So I know a lot of people in Petrobras. Now I cover the company from sell side analyst. But so that's why I focused more on the commodity side. So because I used to work in multinational companies that provided services to the commodity industry, not only commodity industry as well as the buy side industry, as well as banks and brokerage house. But my main focus was the commodities companies, and then in S&P it was only commodities, right? And I had the opportunity to travel around the region, so I visited Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Bolivia, as well as other LATAM countries with huge presence in commodities. Of course, Brazil is the biggest one, but we have other countries in the region as well that have maybe state-owned companies as well as private-owned companies. So I used to visit those companies and try to help them manage risk, manage pricing data, commodities benchmarks. So that was part of my job. And then in 2021, September 21, I got an invitation to work in Warren. Warren, as you mentioned, is a brokerage house, asset management company in Brazil. Warren, we are the first fee-based company, brokerage house in Brazil. So Brazil is I wrote an article in Financial Business Review recently speaking about the change that we are on right now in Brazil, because the last 20 years, we had a massive change in our financial markets. So people used to save and invest with the big banks, right? And then we moved to the 2.0 commission-based model, but we are trying to start this new 3.0, the fee-based model, which is very common in the US and UK, Europe, but in Brazil we are at the first stage. And Warren is the first company who introduced this model to Brazil. And nowadays the market is changing because there was a massive change in the regulation. CVM, which is the Financial Regulatory Authority, which is similar to the SEC here in Brazil. They published another document changing the rules for financial advisors. So financial advisors had the obligation to work exclusively with one brokerage house, and now they do not have this obligation anymore. And now they have to disclaim, to show the clients how much they are charging for their services, right? So we didn't have this transparency. So this new regulation is very good for the financial markets in Brazil, and maybe it could be useful as well for LATAM region. We are, experiencing a pioneering. We are in a pioneering experience here in Brazil, but we are at the first steps. And Warren is positioned to capture this regulatory change, right? So I accepted this challenge in September 21. I came to Warren to start the research department. The company was mainly focused on buy-side activities. So we started sell-side research. So I went to Warren to start this new department. Now I have credit analysts in my team. I have equity analysts as well. Then we cover Brazilian stocks as well as Brazilian debit markets.
Yeah, one of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you is because you're right. There's been this flourishing of new Brazilian financial services companies in the past, 5 to 10 years. And the content you guys are putting out, like your Twitter profile, it's great. And when I came to Brazil 10 years ago, it was people thought about Itaú and Banco do Brasil, and there were no smaller houses, startup type companies or newer brokerages putting out research. And to see really good research coming out of tech first, new startup type fintech companies is really interesting. So that's great. I think your background's amazing. Obviously, everyone's going to be interested to hear what you think about the oil and gas sector. So let's get into it. So I guess let's set the level first. What are your views on oil right now? We're sitting 85, 87 a barrel. Are you bullish or bearish? How are you thinking about the global oil market at the moment?
Well, that's a very good question, Patrick. I think in terms of fundamentals, we're probably going to see oil prices higher than average for a long time, right? So I'm structurally bullish. However, I do not think that the fundamentals suggest a price much higher than the price that we're seeing right now, right? So what I do think is that the fundamentals support high level prices, maybe beyond 80 per barrel for a long period, right? So I do not see that oil prices coming back to $70 or $60 per barrel, because we do not see nowadays capex for oil and gas industry. The global majors are trying to invest in sustainability. They're shifting their investments. Brazil maybe is the only country who is still investing heavily in the oil and gas industry. Maybe Guyana as well. Latin America is a little bit different from the other regions. And if we think about the last oil discoveries, the main projects, the biggest discoveries came from LATAM. We can speak about the pre-salt, which is, if pre-salt was a country nowadays, it would be it would be around the top 10, top 11 producers in the world, right? So pre-salt is very huge. And we recently had Guyana as well. So Guyana is rapidly ramping up their production. And it's also a competitor for Brazil oil and gas companies, right? And Brazil is on its path to become one of the top 5 oil and gas producers, right? We are in the 8 to 9 position, depends, on the data and the month you're analyzing, but we are on a path to maybe in 2030 become one of the top 5 oil producers and exporters. So Brazil, it's a little bit different, but when we look all over the world, we can see few projects, so a capex which is reduced when we compare to other moments in our recent history, and demand for oil as well as refined products will keep up until 2030, until early 2030. So we're probably going to see oil prices in a trend, in a higher trend than average, maybe the average last 30 or 40 years, right? So that's my opinion. But when it comes to the short term, I mean, we think that the prices nowadays reflect the conditions. We have an environment which is, we have a tough supply. Supply, is impacted by OPEP, is impacted by production cuts, and demand. We saw a negative sentiment in the demand side, which is very related to the narrative of recession in the US, the Federal Reserve going higher with the interest rates. So, of course, this affects the sentiment, but I do see this much more as I can see a financial impact, but not a fundamental impact, because when we look to the oil markets and we have Brent as the most traded benchmark, the Brent contracts trade 10 times more at average than the physical market. So many times we can see speculators making the price, right? And not only the fundamentals in the physical market. So when we look to the physical market, I think that the fundamentals suggest higher prices for longer. But when we look to the speculators, maybe in the short term, this narrative, the Fed, etc., the interest rates, obviously could impact the oil prices, and we can see a higher volatility than normal, right? So that's something that I like to look at, the positions from the traders, the long and short ratio. So this data came from CFTC every week. So we look closely to this data because this suggests that sometimes we look at the long and short ratio from ICE, for Brent, as well as NYMEX WTI. And this suggests maybe that the market's more bullish or more bearish, but it's completely different from the fundamentals in my opinion, right? So one thing is the short term, which is much more related to the speculators, and the other thing is the fundamentals from the physical market. So I'm bullish on the fundamentals of the physical market, but I cannot say much about the short term because of this magnitude of the spectrum.
Sure. So let's focus on the long term then. So we're structurally bullish in the long term. We think Brazil is going to keep growing its production and become more globally relevant, right? Moving up the rankings of countries. So what are some of the lesser known Brazilian oil and gas stocks that you guys follow? Everyone knows Petrobras, but there's also a lot of other very compelling companies on the B3 that most investors won't know. So what company would you like to highlight that you think is worth talking about?
Yeah, well, the Brazilian oil market has suffered a massive change recently because, of course, everyone knows Petrobras, and Petrobras has suffered an enormous transition during the last 10 years. So I remember in 2016 when I used to work in Refinitiv, I used to receive emails such as, please cancel the terminal access for this client urgently. And I used to look at this email and look at the newspaper, and the client was in jail, right? So this was the level of compliance that we had in Petrobras. The company was 10 years ago the most in-depth company in the world. So we were in a phase of the pre-salt. Huge capex in pre-salt, so the company was investing heavily on pre-salt. And then afterwards, what happened? Petrobras suffered this massive change. So, the compliance procedures got very, very, very high level. I remember that, I used to go, as I mentioned, I used to go to Petrobras physically. And then in 2016, 2017, we went there and people were just driving a small car full of water and drinks and whatever you wanted. And then afterwards, after Lava Jato operation, which was the police, it was the police operation that got people in jail, everything. Petrobras came from 8 to 80, right? So it was impossible to give them a gift, right? So you couldn't go to Petrobras and give them an agenda or whatever, like a $5 gift. You couldn't do that. And there was an enormous bureaucracy to renew contracts, to speak with people, to invite people for lunch. People would say via email, okay, I can go lunch together with you, but I will pay for my meal. You can't pay for my meal. So it was massive change.
So the whole industry benefited from this compliance and professionalization. So it changed not only Petrobras, it changed how the whole industry started operating in Brazil.
Exactly. So Petrobras nowadays is a company that has this compliance procedures very close to Shell, to Chevron, to other companies, to other major companies. The difference is that the Brazilian government holds a stake in the company. It's the majority stake in the company, right? So it's still a state-owned company. And of course, the government has the power to select the management. They can select the counselors. So of course, the government still has some power, some voting power. So, but the problem is the thing is the government can't do what they have done in Petrobras during Lava Jato and before. Because nowadays, one of the biggest changes that Lava Jato made is that nowadays the directors from Petrobras, they sign the projects at their names. So they could be responsible, they could be in jail if something goes wrong. So the company has this obligation to, if they do not profit, they have to explain why, and people could go to jail. So, it's very heavy compliance procedures, lots of committees. People won't get approved to go to the council, to go to the board of directors without passing through these committees.
So does that mean it's become less politicized then? So the government appointees, it's not as big of a deal as it used to be.
Exactly.
It's not, when the new government comes in, sure, they change their appointees, but the appointees have less power.
Exactly. So one of the major concerns related to Petrobras was the elections last year. So it was very, very tough period in Brazil because, we had a far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, which was the former president, and also a far-left candidate, we can say like that, which is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Lula, which is our president now. So the people in Brazil got very, very, the fire went up, right?
Because all of this non-compliance stuff at Petrobras was when PT Lula's party was in power before. So there was a huge concern that they were going to go in and start changing things back to the way they were at Petrobras. Is that right?
Exactly. So,
and has there been any of that since Lula's been the president? Have they changed anything in the last 10 months or so?
Yes, they have changed, but it was, completely normal market practices. So that's why the stock is in an upward trend since, early this year. So if you go to Petrobras stock, you can see that that's a massive, massive trend.
I think I saw the other day that if you exclude Petrobras from the Ibovespa, then the Bovespa is negative on the year. I think it's literally all the gains that are happening in Brazil right now are Petrobras.
Exactly. And many hedge fund managers, portfolio managers, analysts were skeptical about Petrobras because they got
they got caught up in the political they got caught up in the election cycle, and they were sidelined on Petrobras. Meanwhile, oil prices went up. Petrobras did well, and I guess now are they chasing? Are they starting to allocate now, or are they still sitting on the sidelines?
Yeah, I think they're still sitting on the sides because there was a concern, and this was the major concern, which was related to the IPP prices. So Petrobras started in 2017 because Petrobras is an integrated oil and gas company. That's important to mention. Petrobras not only produces oil but also commercializes gasoline, diesel, and other fuels in Brazil, and they have around 80% of market share in Brazil. So that's kind of the scenario nowadays. But in 2017, Petrobras started with the new government took place after the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, which was former president and elected by PT, which is the party that is now in power. So she got impeached, and then Michel Temer, which was the vice president at the time, became the president. And after that, he allocated a market guy in Petrobras, which was Pedro Parente. It was an executive in the financial industry, and Pedro Parente started a new pricing mechanism, which was the IPP. So the IPP, import parity prices, was the formula that Petrobras used to update the fuel prices in Brazil. So what was the problem with IPP? Right. Of course, it's good to have parity with international prices, right? Because that was the problem with Petrobras before. Petrobras wasn't a profitable company because the government used Petrobras to subsidize the fuels, especially gasoline and diesel in Brazil, right? And Brazil has an important when we look to the context in Brazil, we have a lot of trucks getting stuff in the country. We do not have trains. We have agriculture products are delivered via trucks. Yeah. So what's the problem? When the diesel goes up, it's inflation. It's inflation. Yeah. It's almost instantaneously, right? And the truck drivers have got some bargaining power because if they stop, we stay without food.
The agriculture products die, right? They rot. They go bad.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So what happened? They stopped when Petrobras got this IPP, and then there was frequent updates in the gasoline and diesel prices, and then they just stopped, and we lost a lot of money because of that, not only in the stock market but in the real economics as well. So after that, Petrobras stopped it, realizing this updates very frequently, and they started looking at the prices for a longer period, maybe 2 to 3 weeks to 4 weeks, moving average to maybe adjust the gasoline and diesel prices accordingly to the IPP. So the IPP was still respected, but the frequency was a little bit more longer for the price updates. And then the IPP was very good, and the market got a little bit more comfortable to invest in the oil and gas sector here in Brazil. So one of the major concerns when it comes to Petrobras was the IPP change. So this government that is nowadays in power in Brazil, they advised that before the election that they're going to change the IPP. So this was the problem. So because people thought, come on, if you're going to change the IPP, this is going to be the same as we saw in 2013, 2014, 2015. So the PT is going to use Petrobras to subsidize the prices. So, but what's the problem? Sorry, go ahead.
What's the benefit to PT for subsidizing? It's just a political issue for them? They say, hey, we're going to lower the cost to fill your car up? Is that all it is?
Yeah, it's because, Brazil has a history of, not only Brazil, but LATAM has a history of inflation, right? Mm-hmm. When you start asking the population about political rejection, the main driver for rejection is inflation.
Yeah.
So when we look from the last year to Jair Bolsonaro's government, we have lots of criticism to speak about. So we can say that the government didn't went well during the pandemic. We can say that he was not prepared for the role. We can say about the Amazon forest. We can say lots of things. But the main driver for him to not get elected again, re-elected, was inflation. People mentioned that. So what's the issue here? If inflation ramps up in Brazil, the PT could use Petrobras again to subsidize the fields
and make it into a campaign issue and say, look, we'll get inflation down, we'll mess around at Petrobras, vote for us. Makes sense.
Exactly. So this was the main concern. But there are changes that we could not ignore nowadays in Brazil. Last year, the government did use Petrobras to when it comes to the inflation and fuel prices, right? But they didn't do this directly. So because the government is the major stockholder, Petrobras stockholder. If they do that, they're going to be responsible. The directors are going to be responsible.
And they're paying for it somewhere, right? Because that's less revenue coming in that has to come from somewhere else, right?
Exactly. And since Petrobras started, making huge profits and paying massive dividends, the governments benefited.
They like it.
They like it because they looked through it and said, come on, I have
don't mess around with this. Come on.
Yeah, I have billions of reais here to compound my budget. This is totally extra. I was not counting on this. So Brazil, had a massive tax revenue last year and extra revenue that came from dividends from state-owned companies. So they looked through it and say, come on, it's better for the government to subsidize the fields with our own budget rather than
the profits,
using Petrobras
rather than destroy the profit-making machine.
Exactly, because otherwise we're gonna pay twice. We're gonna pay.
Exactly.
Okay, so I prefer to pay only once, right?
No.
So the government's not stupid. So they did that. They just cut taxes last year for a while. It was between June, July until February this year. So they limited the taxes because of the higher prices. And nowadays, I think that if the oil prices go beyond $100 again, that's probably what they're going to do. They will find another alternative rather than subsidize directly via Petrobras. So that was my call last year. I used to say, come on, you're thinking that we're still in 2013, 2014, and we're not anymore. So we still have Petrobras in our portfolios in Warren, but we did catch this full upside, right? We are investor from Petrobras since 2021. So
and you mentioned that you think local investors, a lot of the ones that got caught up in the political, are still sidelined. So is that still something that you don't think is understood fully by the market? You think a lot of investors are still kind of waiting for it to go back to 2013?
Yeah, they just they're not because of course there is a risk. There is a risk. I won't be the guy to say that there's no risk that the government go ahead and do something like that. Of course, there is this risk. But I think that, if you look to the prices, the probability is a little bit higher than it should. So when you go to the models, valuation, and safety margin, I still think that we can see some upside in the stock. We do not have the same size, the same position size that we used to have before, but we're still positioned, and when we look to the other portfolio managers, the consensus is that I won't take this risk. I do not want to stay in the hands of the PT, right? But it's quite curious because people think that this is an enormous risk, and I do think that this is an important risk. But people compare stocks in Brazil, tiny stocks, small cap stocks, that for me have much more risk than Petrobras,
Sure.
So I can't understand this kind of thoughts, right? But people, especially the portfolio managers that saw what happened to Petrobras maybe 10 years ago, they are still waiting maybe to make these positions.
So that was a great history of Petrobras. That was amazing. And I have one more question here about Petrobras, but it's kind of looking to the future of Petrobras. So it made news recently that they received permits to start drilling the northeast of Brazil on the equatorial margin. So can you just talk about what's the significance of that? Why is that a big deal? And what kind of exploration upside do you still see at Petrobras?
Well, it's very a big deal when it comes to the equatorial margin. This region is very close to Guyana, right? So it's very close to where Guyana found oil, and it's drilling oil nowadays. So it's a very, very huge potential to Petrobras. When you look to the Guyana reserves, if we just compare the Guyana reserves to what we could drill as well in the equatorial margin as a proxy, it could be about the pre-salt, right? So it's huge. It's
so
massive,
it could double the existing pre-salt reserves.
Yeah,
which would be doubling the 11th largest producer in the world.
Exactly. So this is very huge. This is it's not something that's going to happen in the next quarter or in the next year. It's going to take time, as well as the pre-salt. As I mentioned, the pre-salt is still evolving. Nowadays, 78% of the Petrobras production came from pre-salt. It's huge nowadays, but we still have work to do. Petrobras is still investing in pre-salt. Even if we don't have equatorial margin, we're still going to be one of the top 5 producers in 2030, 2031, right? So I'm not counting on this.
It's a call option. It's a call option within the Petrobras stock.
It's a call option. Exactly. So but this movement is very important because it consolidates Petrobras' strategy in Brazil, which is also good to the other Brazilian companies, the junior oil companies, as we say here. So because... Just complete. Because what Petrobras did in the last 5 years, they started divesting in assets that do not produce the same return as drilling oil in the pre-salt. Just for you to have some magnitude, Petrobras produces oil without royalty costs and revenue share with the government. They produce oil in pre-salt $5 barrel per. That's the cost to produce oil in pre-salt. $5 per barrel.
All in. That's all in sustaining. That's including.
All in is $20. All in $20.
All in $20 a barrel.
So that's impressive, right? That's impressive. Yeah. So they're gonna. There's nothing compared to produce oil $20 per barrel, right? So Petrobras wouldn't have any other projects, renewables, gas, whatever, that would produce the same result, the same return. Mm-hmm. So what they started doing, they started having agreements with the CADE, which is the regulator for competitive environment in Brazil, to sell refineries. They started selling their gas and transportation business. They started to sell assets that were not huge enough for them to operate. So since they started selling those assets, the competition environment in Brazil became much more, market oriented. So Petrobras started focusing on pre-salt in huge fields, oil fields, and then they sold minor fields to the junior oil companies. So that's why we saw in the last 5 years IPOs from companies in the oil and gas industry in Brazil. So we have nowadays listed at the Brazilian Stock Exchange Petrobras. We have PetroRio, which is PetroRio. this is the biggest independent producer in Brazil. They are producing roughly 100,000 barrels per day. We have 3R, we have Enalta, and we also have PetroRio. So we can share the tickers.
Of course, in the show notes.
Yeah, but they're smaller producers who benefited from this from Petrobras strategy, and they are as I mentioned, PetroRio is the biggest one and produces 100,000 barrels per day. Petrobras produces 3 million barrels per day. So it's very big.
What about like new production financing? So like, do you see like companies listing as an exploration company, like you see in the mining sector on Toronto Stock Exchange? It'll be an exploration company. They'll find copper, they'll find gold, then they'll go and finance it in the markets. And then, do you see that in Brazil yet, or is the market still not that mature? Are there pure play exploration companies in Brazil?
Yes, all of these general oil companies are only exploration and production companies. So Petrobras is the only integrated oil and gas company in Brazil. Okay. The other ones are just E&P, exploration and production.
Okay.
So it's a win-win situation, because Petrobras focuses on the biggest fields, and the smaller companies they're much more efficient than Petrobras to work with the smaller fields. So PetroRio, for instance, they produce oil for $7 per barrel.
I saw their lifting costs are $7 a barrel.
It's ridiculous. They have EBITDA margin of 70%. It's ridiculous. So the same for PetroRio is the most competitive oil and gas producer. But if you go to the other ones, they produce oil. Their lifting cost is around $15 per barrel. So it's very, because that's why Brazil has this competitive advantage, in my opinion, in the oil and gas industry, because we have the three pillars. We have lower lifting costs. We have good oil quality, which could be refined everywhere, and we also have low carbon intensity in oil production. So those three pillars will probably make Brazil, change the geopolitics of oil and gas in the next maybe 10 years, right? So Brazil will have another role in the geopolitics.
Interesting. And what does the tax burden look like for the non-state-owned oil and gas companies in Brazil? We know Petrobras, but for the private companies, I imagine they're fairly heavily taxed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Brazil is
high taxes for everybody, right?
Yeah, high tax for everybody. We can see that roughly 34%. That is the base tax rate. In February this year, the government started another tax regime for oil exports, but it was just a provision for a while. The government wanted to raise revenue, so they started raising taxes for everyone, and the oil and gas industry was a target because as I mentioned, the lifting cost is low, oil prices are higher, so the companies are making lots of profit. So the government started an export tax. It was 9% roughly from revenue, but this tax just got killed. So in June, so it was just for a while, maybe 4 to 6 months, and then the government stopped this tax because, of course, the government will lose because as I mentioned, the competitive landscape changed. There are much more investments nowadays in the oil and gas industry in Brazil. So if you raise taxes, maybe some projects won't have a rate of return that will be attractive for investors. So that's why the government went back and cut this tax in the end of June.
Great. So that's my list of questions that I had to talk to you about. Is there anything else related to what we talked about that you want to highlight? Is there anything we missed, you think?
Yeah, just to emphasize that, I do think that when it comes to the Brazilian market, the stock exchange, we see Brazilian stocks trading nowadays at lower multiples than than average. When we compare to other countries, especially emerging countries, we do see Brazil discounted. So we in Warren, we have an overweight position nowadays in Brazilian equities, and an overweight position in oil and gas when compared to other sectors as well as the index. So I do think that the oil and gas history in Brazil is not starting today, and it's not ending in a few quarters or in a few years. So I think it's a long-term story. And I think that and Petrobras is part of this story, and maybe it's the most famous actor.
Right.
But there are other actors as well. There are other companies playing an important role in Brazilian oil and gas industry that will probably benefit during this transition period. So I do think Brazil oil and gas will be maybe one of the sectors that will that with most growth rates in the next 10 years in Brazil. Of course, we are strong. We have some competitive advantage in some sectors: oil and gas, pulp and paper, agricultural products, iron ore. Brazil should focus on this competitive advantage, and we are definitely focused on oil and gas nowadays. So that's why I'm bullish in Brazil oil and gas companies nowadays.
Great. Frederico, this was an awesome conversation. I learned a ton listening to you. I'm sure the audience will too. Where can anyone that wants to get in touch with you or follow along to your work? I know your Twitter's great. Everyone should follow it. I'll put it in the show notes, but where else?
Well, Twitter, so Frederico Nobre, as well as LinkedIn, the same, Frederico Nobre. And I do have a profile in Instagram as well, which is Economia do Dia, and this is my profile, where I share things that are happening in Instagram as well here in Brazilian financial markets. So that's it, and I appreciate a lot this conversation, Patrick, and I hope that your audience understand my English.
No, you speak very well. I promise I wouldn't lie to you. Like, it was very good, and we'll follow up with you next year, and we'll do this again and check in on Petrobras and some of the other companies and see what you think about oil, because this was great.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much
for the invitation.
It's nice meeting you.